Daniel Hayes had lived on the same stretch of desert land for almost his entire life, yet every morning still felt new to him. The sun always rose the same way, slow and warm over the Arizona horizon. But he never stopped pausing to watch it. He would stand on his wooden porch with a cup of warm coffee in his hands, letting the soft morning air touch his face. It was a peaceful moment, maybe the most peaceful part of his day, but also a reminder of how quiet his life had become. His ranch sat far from any highway, surrounded by wide, open land. The nearest neighbor was several miles away. At first, Daniel liked that silence. When he inherited the ranch from his father nearly 20 years ago, he enjoyed the freedom and the privacy. But as the years passed, that same silence grew heavy, like a soft weight sitting on his shoulders. He never complained about it, but he felt it deeply. The long days became longer. The nights felt endless, and the big empty sky above him sometimes made him feel smaller than he wanted to admit. Most days began the same way. He finished his coffee, set the mug on the porch rail, and walked toward the barn. His boots crunched over the dry dirt, following a path he had walked so many times that the ground itself seemed shaped by his steps. Inside the barn, his horse, Willow, would lift her head and nicker softly at him. Willow had been his companion for years, and Daniel talked to her more than he talked to people. He would run his hand down her neck, feed her oats, and sometimes just stand with her for minutes without saying anything. It wasn't that he expected her to speak back, he simply liked having another living soul nearby. After taking care of Willow, he would begin his daily chores, fixing fences, checking the water lines, moving supplies from the shed, clearing debris after windstorms. There was always something that needed doing. The work was steady, honest, and predictable. Daniel didn't mind it. In fact, he liked that his hands always had something to do. But there were moments, small ones that arrived quietly during the day, when he would pause and look around the empty land and wonder how many years could pass this same way. Lunch was usually just a sandwich he ate on his porch. Sometimes he sat in silence. Other times he flipped through old letters from his father that he kept in a wooden box. His father had passed away long ago, but Daniel still felt his presence in every part of the ranch, the tools he left behind, the old photographs, the stories he used to tell about the land. Daniel often thought about how his father had never truly been alone here. There had been community gatherings, friendly neighbors visiting for a meal, and long conversations at the kitchen table. Daniel tried to remember the sound of those voices, but time had faded the details. The afternoons were warm and slow. Daniel would ride Willow across the ranch, checking that everything was where it should be. The wind carried the faint smell of desert sage. Birds circled high above. Sometimes he saw the tracks of animals, rabbits, deer, the occasional coyote, but rarely did he see another person. Still, there were places on his land that made him feel connected to something older than himself. One of those places was the canyon near the southeast side of the ranch. The canyon wasn't large, but it had a quiet beauty. The layered rocks, the patterns carved by wind and time, the soft shade in the deeper parts, it all felt untouched, almost sacred. Daniel often rode there in the late afternoon to watch the sunlight shift across the stone walls. He knew the land had once belonged to the Apache people, and he respected that deeply. He felt it in the ground beneath his feet, in the silence of the canyon, in the way the air changed the moment he stepped inside. It was a place that didn't need words to explain its importance. One evening, while riding near the canyon, Daniel noticed something unusual. The earth was softer than usual, as if someone had recently walked through. There were footprints not from an animal, but from a person. Several sets, in fact. He stopped Willow and studied them. They were fresh, maybe from the same day. Daniel wasn't alarmed. His land wasn't exactly locked away from the world. Travelers sometimes wandered through these parts, though it wasn't common. Still, there was something different about these footprints. They moved with purpose, not lingering, not lost. It was as though whoever made them knew the land well. He followed the prints for a short distance until they disappeared behind a cluster of rocks. He could have kept tracking them, But he chose not to. He respected the land and anyone who walked through it, and he didn't want to seem like he was invading someone's journey. Instead, he quietly turned Willow around and rode back toward the ranch, though the footprints remained in his mind. That night, after feeding Willow and locking up the barn, Daniel stood outside under the clear sky. The stars were bright, scattered across the darkness like tiny lanterns. He could hear the distant sounds of insects and the soft rustle of the wind. It was peaceful, but he didn't feel peaceful inside. Something unsettled him, not in a frightening way, but in a way that stirred his curiosity. It had been a long time since anything unexpected happened in his quiet life. He sat on his porch for a long while, watching the land fade into shadow. He tried to imagine the kind of people who might have passed through the canyon. Travelers, campers, or perhaps someone from the nearby communities. He had heard stories about families who walked the land to honor old traditions. Maybe it was something like that. Daniel didn't know, but he felt a strange sense of anticipation, as though the land was waiting for something. Or someone. The next morning came as usual, with the warm sunlight and the soft breeze. But Daniel felt different. He paid more attention to the sound of the wind, to the shape of the clouds, to the movements around him. He kept glancing toward the canyon, almost expecting to see someone there. He didn't know why he felt that way, but the feeling was strong and steady, like a quiet whisper in the back of his mind. He finished his chores early, then prepared Willow and rode toward the canyon again. The footprints were still there, though some had faded slightly. He examined them again, noticing their size and shape. They belonged to more than one person, possibly several. Their stride was relaxed, confident, almost familiar with the terrain. Daniel felt a small shiver of curiosity run through him. He wasn't used to surprises, and this small discovery felt like the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. As the sun set that evening, painting the land with warm gold and soft orange, Daniel sat on the porch again. He watched the horizon, listening to the silence. The ranch looked the same as it always had: the barn, the fences, the long dirt road, but Daniel felt something shifting. It wasn't something he could see. It was something he felt deep inside, like a door opening quietly after being closed for too long. For the first time in many years, Daniel wondered if he truly was alone out there. Not in a sad way, but in a hopeful way, as though life was gently reminding him that the world still held surprises. He didn't know that the footprints belonged to 4 sisters who would soon step onto his land with a purpose older than his own lifetime. He didn't know that they carried a story that connected to his family, one he had never heard before. He didn't know that their arrival would bring change, not loud, not sudden, but meaningful. All he knew in that moment was that the land felt different, as if waiting. And deep inside, Daniel felt the same. The silence around him no longer felt heavy. For the first time in a long time, it felt like silence before a new beginning. Daniel woke earlier than usual the next morning, long before the sun had fully climbed over the horizon. He didn't know why he had woken up so early, but there was a feeling inside him, something like quiet energy. It wasn't worry, and it wasn't fear. It was simply a sense that something was moving toward him, something he couldn't yet see. The breeze that came through his open window felt fresh and cool, carrying with it a feeling of change. He stepped outside with his coffee and stood on the porch. The sky was a pale blue, slowly brightening with soft streaks of morning light. He scanned the land without really thinking about it, his eyes drifting toward the old canyon, then toward the distant tree line, then back to the empty road. Everything looked normal, completely ordinary, but the feeling inside him would not fade. After finishing his drink, he walked to the barn and greeted Willow with a gentle pat. She lifted her head and nudged his shoulder lightly, as if sensing his thoughts. Animals often notice things before humans did, and Willow had always been unusually aware of shifts in the world around them. Daniel stroked her mane for a moment, letting her calm presence ease his mind. Once the morning chores were done, he found himself drawn again toward the southeast side of the ranch. It wasn't part of his usual routine to visit the same spot 2 days in a row, but something urged him there. Willow trotted slowly as Daniel guided her along the narrow trail leading toward the canyon. The wind carried a faint warmth now as the sun grew brighter. When he reached the canyon, he dismounted and walked forward quietly. The footprints from the day before were even lighter now, softened by the wind that had passed through during the night. He crouched down and pressed his fingers into the dirt. The ground was cool, shaded by the nearby rocks. Whoever had walked through here had been light on their feet, and they had moved with purpose. He stood and looked around, taking a slow breath. The land hummed with a strange energy, gentle but present. He wasn't sure if he imagined it, or if something was truly different. Then, just as he began to turn back toward Willow, he heard something soft, almost unnoticeable. A faint crunch of footsteps coming from behind a cluster of sage bushes. Daniel turned slowly. The footsteps grew clearer, steady, and calm. His heart beat a little faster, more out of curiosity than anything else. For a moment, he wondered if it might be a wandering traveler, or perhaps someone looking for directions. But when the figures appeared, stepping into view from the shade of the rocks, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. There were 4 of them, 4 women walking together in a quiet, steady formation. They were dressed in simple clothing, long skirts, comfortable boots, and light shawls that moved gently with the breeze. Their hair was long and dark, braided in traditional styles that Daniel recognized from his limited knowledge of the Apache community. Each one carried a small bundle at her side, and they walked with confidence, as though the land beneath their feet was familiar in a way Daniel could never fully understand. The sisters stopped a short distance from him, standing together in a line. They didn't seem surprised to see him. In fact, they looked almost as though they had expected him to be there. Daniel felt his heart beating faster again, not from fear, but from the intensity of the moment. He sensed that their arrival was not random. The eldest of the 4 stepped slightly forward. Her expression was calm, steady, and warm. Her posture carried a quiet strength that made Daniel feel both curious and respectful at the same time. She spoke, gently. "We don't mean to intrude. We've come here with respect." Daniel nodded slowly. "This land is open. You're welcome to be here." His voice sounded softer than he expected, as if the dry air had touched his throat. The eldest sister gave a small smile. "My name is Nayeli," she said. "These are my sisters Tala, Onawa, and Kanti." The younger 3 nodded politely. He introduced himself simply, Daniel Hayes. There was a brief moment of silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The 4 sisters looked around the ranch with soft eyes, taking in the landscape with the same appreciation Daniel always felt. The breeze brushed past them, carrying the warmth of the coming day. Finally, Nayeli met Daniel's eyes again. Her voice was gentle, but there was a depth to it, as if she carried a message from far back in time. "We came for you." The words landed softly, but they struck Daniel with a kind of quiet force. He blinked in confusion, not sure he had heard her correctly. "For me?" he repeated. "Yes," Nayeli said, her tone steady and sincere. Daniel didn't know what to think. He had never met them before. He had never visited their community. He lived alone, and didn't cross paths with many people. The idea that 4 strangers had come specifically for him felt impossible. He took a slow step forward. I don't understand." Tala, the second oldest, spoke next. Her voice was lighter, but equally warm. "It's not something we can explain in a single sentence. It's connected to our family, and to yours." Daniel stared at them, completely unsure what they meant. "My family?" he echoed quietly. "I don't know anything about a connection." Onawa shook her head softly. "You wouldn't. The connection isn't recent. It's old, much older than you." Daniel felt the wind shift slightly. A soft rustle passed through the canyon, almost like nature itself was listening. He gestured toward the open space near the canyon. "If you'd like water or a place to rest, you're welcome at my ranch." It was the only thing he could think to offer. Hospitality was something his father always believed in, and Daniel carried that value with him. The sisters exchanged a thoughtful glance. Conti, the youngest, nodded. "We accept, with gratitude." Daniel guided them back toward the ranch, walking beside them as Willow followed close behind. The atmosphere felt strangely peaceful despite the mystery. Daniel wasn't nervous, he was simply full of questions. When they reached the porch, Daniel handed them a jug of cool water and cups, then stepped aside to let them rest. They quietly thanked him, sitting in the shade as they drank. The way they moved calm, respectful, observant, made Daniel feel comfortable around them. After a moment, Nayeli spoke again. "We know this visit may seem strange to you, but we came with purpose." Daniel sat down on a nearby chair. "I'm listening," he said gently. Tala leaned forward slightly. "Our great-grandmother lived not far from this land many years ago. She had a story one passed down through generations." Onawa added, "That story involved your family." Daniel's eyebrows lifted in surprise. He felt his heart beat in his throat. "My family? My father never mentioned anything like that." "Lifton," Conti answered softly. "Many stories are not written. They live through people, through memory, through promises." Nayeli nodded in agreement. "Our great-grandmother made a promise that connects us to you, and that promise is the reason we came." Daniel felt something deep inside him shift, something curious, something quiet, something old. The sisters spoke with such certainty that he didn't doubt them, even though he didn't fully understand yet. He looked at them, the four of them sitting calmly on his porch, their expressions warm but serious. They looked like people who carried something important, something that belonged to the past but still had meaning today. Nayeli met his eyes again, her voice soft. "We came for you because the time has come to honor that promise, and because something in you called out to us." Daniel didn't know what to say. He felt as though the land itself had been preparing him for this moment, even though he hadn't known it. The footprints, the feeling of change, the strange pull toward the canyon. It all made sense now, at least in a quiet, emotional way. The day moved gently around them. The wind softened. The sky brightened. And for the first time in a very long time, Daniel didn't feel alone. Something had arrived in his life, something unexpected, something meaningful, something that would change everything. And the four Apache sisters, sitting calmly on his porch, were the beginning of it. Daniel sat quietly on the porch, listening as the four sisters settled comfortably in the shade. The warm afternoon light stretched long shadows across the dusty ground, and the soft breeze carried the gentle scent of desert sage. The moment felt calm, but Daniel could sense something deeper beneath the calmness, like a story waiting to unfold. A story he somehow belonged to without ever knowing it. Nayeli, the eldest sister, took a slow sip of water before speaking again. She looked out over the land as if she could see memories hidden beneath the earth. "Our great-grandmother's name was Ayana," she began softly. "Her story is the reason we are here." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He didn't want to interrupt. He wanted to understand every word. Tala continued the story. "Ayana was young when she lived near this land. It was a different time back then. Quiet, peaceful, but also full of challenges. She was strong, kind, and wise. Even as a young woman, she had a deep connection with the land. She always said the desert spoke to her heart," Onawa added gently. "One day, while traveling near the edge of the canyon, she was caught in a sudden storm. Not a harsh one, but one strong enough to make her lose her way. She found herself wandering longer than she meant to. She grew tired, and she felt far from home." Daniel listened with stillness. He didn't know where this story would lead, but the way the sisters spoke made him feel as if he were watching the past fold itself gently into the present. Conti took a breath before continuing. She eventually found shelter near a small ridge. There, she met a young man who had seen her from a distance and came to guide her. He helped her find safety and stay warm until the sky cleared. He gave her food, water, and stayed by her until she felt strong again. Nayeli looked directly at Daniel then. "That young man was your grandfather." Daniel felt a quiet shock move through him. "My grandfather?" he repeated softly, almost to himself. His grandfather had passed away long before Daniel was old enough to remember much about him. Most of what he knew came from old photographs and stories his father used to tell. But none of his father's stories ever mentioned something like this. Tala nodded with calm certainty. "Yes. Your grandfather. Before he built the house your father grew up in, he traveled this land freely, helping anyone he found in need. Our great-grandmother never forgot what he did for her." For a moment, Daniel couldn't speak. He stared at the boards of the porch beneath his feet, processing the weight of the story. He tried to imagine his grandfather as a young man, walking these same lands, offering kindness to a stranger who needed help. Nayeli's voice softened even more. "Ayana always said kindness creates a bridge between people, even if they are from different worlds. She believed your grandfather's kindness was a gift she needed to honor. Before she passed, she made a promise." Daniel lifted his gaze, waiting. She promised that if any descendant of the young man who helped her ever lost their way not on the land, but in their heart, her family would return to guide them, to bring them back to themselves, to remind them that no one truly walks alone. The words settled over Daniel like the gentle weight of a blanket. He didn't know how to respond. He had lived alone for so long that he hadn't realized how deeply that loneliness had sunk into him. He never imagined that his quiet life could be connected to a promise made decades before he was born. Kanti, the youngest sister, watched him with soft eyes. "During one of our ceremonies last month, Ayana's promise came back to us in a strong feeling. It wasn't a message spoken in words, but something felt in our hearts like a pull, a calling," Onawa continued. "We didn't know who we were being called toward. We only knew it was someone connected to the man from Ayana's story. Someone on this land. Someone who carried quiet sadness." Daniel looked up in surprise. "You felt that?" "Yes," Nayeli said gently. "We felt someone who carried a heavy silence. Someone who had strength, but who had forgotten what it feels like to be part of something bigger. That feeling led us here. To you." Daniel took a slow breath. He looked out over the open land, the land he had lived on for so many years. He thought of all the mornings he woke up alone, all the nights spent in quiet silence, all the moments he had shared only with Willow or the sound of the wind. He had accepted that life, without question, but hearing the sisters speak made him realize how deeply human beings need connection, how easily a person can lose themselves when they face their days alone for too long. Nayeli placed her hands gently in her lap. "You may not have known your loneliness was reaching out, but we felt it. Ayana's promise guided us." Daniel felt a warm, unfamiliar emotion growing in his chest. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't afraid. He simply felt seen. Seen in a way he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. Tala spoke again. "We want to show you the places Ayana once walked. Places connected to your grandfather. The land remembers more than we do. Sometimes, walking through it helps you understand things words cannot express." Daniel nodded slowly. "I'd like that," he said. His voice was soft but sincere. The sisters smiled gently, as if they had been hoping he would say that. They rose from their seats, and Daniel led them across the ranch. They walked slowly, almost reverently. Daniel noticed the way the sisters looked around them, not as visitors, but as people greeting an old friend. Their steps were light, their eyes observant, and their presence felt grounding. They reached the trail near the canyon. Nayeli paused, touching a smooth stone with her fingertips. "Ayana spoke of this place," she said quietly. "She said it guided her when she felt lost. She always believed the land held its own wisdom." Daniel watched her, feeling a calmness settle into him. The canyon looked the same as it always had, but somehow it felt more alive now, warmed by the presence of the sisters and the story they carried. They walked deeper into the canyon, stopping at small landmarks, an old twisted tree, a narrow path between two tall rocks, a natural arch where sunlight formed soft patterns. At each spot, one of the sisters explained how Ayana had spoken of it, how she described the way the land helped her find peace after moments of confusion or fear. The more they walked, the more Daniel felt something inside him untangle. Memories of his father and grandfather surfaced gently. He remembered small things, conversations, gestures, pieces of advice. He realized how often he had carried their teachings without realizing it. He also realized how disconnect had slowly grown in him over the years. Unnoticed and unspoken, Nayeli noticed the thoughtful look on his face. "You've carried a lot alone," she said softly. "But you don't have to." Daniel swallowed gently. "I didn't know anyone could feel what I felt." "We didn't feel your thoughts," Tala said. "We felt your silence. A silence that comes from living too long without people around you. It's a quiet loneliness, one that grows slowly, without asking permission." Daniel nodded. The words fit him perfectly. They spent hours walking through the land, talking about their families, their traditions, and the ways the desert shaped their lives. Daniel shared stories too, stories about his father, teaching him to ride, stories about fixing the ranch with old tools, stories about nights spent under the stars during colder seasons. The sisters listened with warmth and genuine interest. They asked questions, laughed softly, and shared small memories of their own childhood. By the time the sun began to lower in the sky, the group had formed a gentle bond, a bond built from shared stories, shared steps, and shared understanding. As they returned to the ranch, Daniel felt lighter, as though a quiet weight had lifted from his chest. The sisters walked beside him like old friends. Even though they had only just met, something about their presence felt comforting, meaningful, almost destined. When they reached the porch again, Nayeli stopped and turned to him. "Ayana's promise brought us here," she said softly. "But the rest of the journey is about you. Your heart called out. Your spirit needed connection. We didn't come to change your life, we came to remind you of the strength you already have." Daniel felt warmth rise in his chest. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for coming, for sharing this. It means more than I can say." Kanti smiled gently. "This is only the beginning." Daniel believed her. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel like a man living alone on an endless stretch of land. He felt connected to the past, to the land, to these 4 sisters, and to something bigger than himself. And deep inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He woke up the next morning with a strange mix of calmness and nervousness in his heart. It was the final stage of his journey, the point where everything he had learned, every moment he had struggled through, and every person who had supported him finally mattered. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't just see a tired face. He saw someone who had grown, someone who had endured many silent battles, someone no longer afraid of the world or of himself. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "This is the day I change everything." As he stepped outside, the sunlight felt softer, almost as if the world itself knew he was walking toward an important moment. For years he had carried doubts, fears, and heavy memories that slowed him down. But now he felt lighter. He realized that true strength didn't come from pretending everything was fine, it came from accepting the truth and still choosing to move forward. The path ahead was not easy. There were still responsibilities, challenges, and decisions waiting for him. But he no longer avoided them. On this day, he had made up his mind to face everything with maturity and patience. He knew that running away from problems only made life heavier. Facing them made life clearer. As he reached the place where he needed to be, he found several familiar faces waiting. They greeted him warmly, with smiles that carried both hope and trust. He never imagined people would believe in him like this, especially after everything he had gone through. For a moment, he stood still, quietly taking in the scene, feeling grateful that life had given him another chance. One person stepped closer, someone who had seen him at his lowest, and still supported him through it all. They looked at him with proud eyes and said gently, "You've come a long way. Whatever happens today, remember that you did not give up. That alone is success. Those words settled into his heart like a warm blanket. He nodded slowly, promising himself that no matter what the outcome was, he would continue moving forward, one steady step at a time. Soon, the process began. The room filled with soft murmurs and occasional laughter as people prepared for the discussions ahead. He watched quietly, absorbing every detail. A few months ago, he would have been overwhelmed by such an environment, but today he felt surprisingly calm. He had learned how to carry himself, how to think clearly, and how to stay patient even when things didn't go his way. When it was finally his turn to speak, he rose to his feet slowly, feeling a small wave of nervousness. He held his hands together, took a breath, and started talking. His voice trembled for a few seconds but soon became steady. He explained everything: his journey, his mistakes, his efforts, his hopes for the future, and his promise to do better every day. He didn't try to make himself look perfect. Instead, he spoke honestly, with sincerity that touched the hearts of everyone listening. By the time he finished, the room had fallen quiet. People looked at him with a kind of respect he had never felt before. It wasn't the respect that comes from success, it was the respect that comes from honesty, growth, and courage. A gentle smile spread across his face as he stepped back and sat down. For the first time in a long time, he felt proud of himself, not because of the outcome, but because he had finally faced everything with an open heart. After the session ended, he stepped outside again. The sun was still shining, and a soft breeze brushed against his face. Several people came up to him, offering supportive words and warm encouragement. Each message felt like a small piece of hope being added to his journey. One person said, "You inspired us today." Another added, "Keep going, you're stronger than you think." Their kindness felt like a gift, and he hugged those words deep inside his heart. The rest of the day unfolded slowly. He walked to a quiet park, a place he used to visit during difficult times. He sat on a bench under a tall tree, watching children play, old friends chat, and people enjoy their small moments of life. Everything around him looked peaceful, and he realized that peace was not something life hands you. You create it by choosing your thoughts carefully. He reflected on his journey, remembering how hard it had been in the beginning. There were days he doubted himself, days he wanted to quit, days he felt alone even in a crowded room. But every difficult moment had taught him something important. Every setback pushed him toward becoming a better version of himself. Without even realizing it, he had learned patience. He had learned how to communicate better, how to control his emotions, how to understand the feelings of others, and how to make decisions without letting fear guide him. He had also learned that forgiving himself was just as important as forgiving others. As the wind rustled through the leaves above him, he closed his eyes for a moment. He whispered a small prayer of gratitude, not for the success he hoped for, but for the strength to reach this point, for the wisdom to see life clearly, for the courage to love himself after everything he had been through. Later in the evening, when he reached home, he found his family waiting. Their faces lit up when they saw him walk in. They could see the change in him, the calmness in his step, and the confidence in his eyes. He shared everything about the day with them, and they listened with pride and relief. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "You've grown so much. We're proud of you." Those words warmed him deeply. Family support had been a huge part of his journey, even in moments when they didn't know exactly what he was going through. That night, he sat alone in his room for a while. He looked at the small notebook he had kept during his journey, a notebook filled with simple messages he wrote to himself on difficult days. Messages like, "Keep walking. You are learning. Better days will come. You can change your story." He turned the pages slowly, remembering every moment he wrote them. Then he picked up a pen and wrote a final line. "I did not give up." He felt a soft smile spreading across his face. It wasn't the smile of someone who had won something, it was the smile of someone who had finally made peace with himself. A peaceful night surrounded him as he lay down to rest. Tomorrow was uncertain, but he knew he was ready. He was no longer afraid of challenges. He was no longer controlled by his past. He had become a person who understood the value of patience, hard work, and hope. Life would still test him in the future, it tests everyone, but now he had the tools to face anything with calmness and confidence. He had learned that real change doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in small steps, quiet decisions, and steady effort. He closed his eyes with a calm heart, knowing that this was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with better choices, healthier habits, meaningful relationships, and a deeper understanding of what truly matters. As he drifted into sleep, one thought stayed in his mind like a gentle light. Today, I became who I was meant to be.